In 1908, a train departed Damascus and arrived in Medina 72 hours later. The same journey had previously taken 40 days by camel caravan. The railway that made this possible was the Hejaz Railway, built under Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II, stretching 1,750 kilometers through what is today Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. It was one of the greatest infrastructure achievements of its era. And then it was destroyed. By war, by politics, by the collapse of the empire that built it. 117 years later, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia are trying to build it again. This is not a heritage project. This is not nostalgia for the Ottoman past. This is a strategic calculation about who controls the trade routes of the 21st century. And if the project succeeds, it will hand Turkey something that no military alliance, no energy deal, and no diplomatic maneuver has been able to provide: structural centrality in the global supply chain. I want to walk you through why this matters, why it might fail, and what the one structural obstacle is that Turkey must solve before any of this becomes real. Because the mainstream coverage of the Hejaz Railway revival is treating it as a regional infrastructure story. The structural analysis reveals it is a global power story, and the outcome will determine whether Turkey becomes the logistics bridge between Europe and Asia or remains a geographic opportunity that never fully converted into strategic reality. The global order is shifting faster than the news cycle can report. Hit subscribe to stay ahead of the curve, because what I am about to show you changes everything. Let me start with the logistics power thesis, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. Most geopolitical analysis focuses on military power and economic output. Who has the largest army? Who has the highest gross domestic product? These are real measures of power. But there is a third category of power that structural history consistently undervalues until it becomes decisive: positional power. The power that comes not from what you produce, but from where you sit in the network through which things flow. Venice in the 15th century did not become the wealthiest city in the world because it had the most productive farms or the largest army. It became wealthy because it sat at the intersection of the trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. Every merchant who wanted to move goods between the Mediterranean world and the Silk Road passed through Venice. Venice took a cut. Venice got rich. Venice got powerful. Singapore in the 20th century did not become one of the wealthiest countries in the world because of natural resources. It became wealthy because it sits at the intersection of the sea lanes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Every container ship moving between Europe and East Asia passes through the Singapore Strait. Singapore built a port. Singapore got rich. Singapore got powerful. The pattern in structural history is consistent. Countries that control the nodes through which trade flows capture disproportionate value from that trade without necessarily producing anything that moves through their territory. They charge fees, they develop services, they attract investment, they accumulate the financial and political relationships that come from being indispensable. Turkey is sitting on a geography that, if properly developed, puts it in exactly this position. It is the land bridge between Europe and Asia. It controls the Turkish Straits, the only maritime connection between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It borders 8 countries. It sits at the intersection of energy pipelines running from the Caspian and the Middle East into Europe. And it is, uniquely, the country that connects the European rail network to the rail networks of the Middle East. Keep that geographic fact in the back of your mind, because the Hejaz Railway project is the mechanism that converts this geography from potential to reality. The first structural force is the corridor opportunity. Right now, a container ship from Shanghai to Frankfurt travels by sea. It passes through the Strait of Malacca, crosses the Indian Ocean, transits the Suez Canal, crosses the Mediterranean, and arrives at a European port. The journey takes approximately 22 to 25 days. It is vulnerable to disruption at the Suez Canal, as the Houthi attacks in 2024 demonstrated, and at the Strait of Hormuz, as the current Iran war is demonstrating. The alternative that the Hejaz Railway revival is designed to enable is a land route. Goods from China and India arrive at a Turkish port on the Mediterranean or Black Sea coast. They transfer to rail. They travel south through Turkey, into Syria, into Jordan, and connect to Saudi Arabia's rail network, which already links Riyadh to Dammam on the Gulf Coast. Total transit time, according to Turkish Transport Ministry projections, 12 to 15 days. half the time of the sea route, at significantly lower cost than the maritime alternative, because rail freight costs per ton kilometer are substantially cheaper than deep-sea shipping for medium-distance journeys. Now I want to go deeper, because this is where most people's analysis completely breaks down. The second structural force is the IMEC problem. And this is where the Hejaz Railway becomes a geopolitical story rather than just an infrastructure story. In September 2023, at the G20 summit in New Delhi, the United States, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Israel, and the European Union announced the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, known as IMEC. The project was designed to create a trade route connecting India to Europe through Gulf ports, across to Israel's port of Haifa, and then onward to Europe by sea. It was explicitly framed as an alternative to Chinese infrastructure influence in the region. It was implicitly designed to route trade through a corridor that excluded Turkey, which is not part of IMEC, and to route it through Israel, which is. Turkey was not pleased. Erdogan publicly dismissed IMEC as a fantasy. He pointed out that a route running through Israel would require India to load goods onto ships, cross the Arabian Sea to a Gulf port, reload onto trucks, cross the Gulf states by road, arrive at an Israeli port, reload onto ships, cross the Mediterranean, and arrive in Europe. Multiple transshipment points, multiple loading and unloading operations, multiple border crossings. Each one adds cost, time, and the possibility of disruption. Then two things happened that changed the geopolitical calculus of IMEC fundamentally. First, the Gaza war made the normalization of Israeli-Arab relations that IMEC depended on politically impossible in the medium term. Saudi Arabia, which was supposed to anchor the Gulf end of IMEC, suspended normalization talks with Israel. Without Saudi participation, IMEC cannot function as designed. Second, the Iran war of 2026 put the Strait of Hormuz under blockade and disrupted the maritime routes that IMEC depended on for its Gulf connections. Ships cannot reliably move between Indian Ocean ports and Gulf ports when the Strait of Hormuz is under contested control. IMEC is not dead, but it is structurally compromised in a way that the Hejaz Railway alternative is not. The land route through Turkey does not require ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. It does not require Israeli-Arab normalization. It does not require the political conditions of September 2023 to remain intact. It requires functioning rail infrastructure and political cooperation among Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Those conditions are significantly easier to meet than the conditions IMEC requires. The Saudi feasibility study, announced this week with a completion target of end of 2026, is the clearest signal yet that Riyadh has made a strategic decision to develop the land route option as an alternative to its now compromised IMEC participation. The third structural force is the finance hub opportunity, and this is the dimension of Turkey's potential that is least discussed and most consequential. The Hejaz Railway is a freight and trade story, but the structural logic of logistics hubs is that they attract financial services as well as physical goods. When goods flow through a location, financial instruments follow. Letters of credit, trade finance, insurance, currency exchange, commodity contracts. The cities that anchor global trade corridors become the cities where the financial infrastructure of that trade is also located. Dubai understood this before almost anyone. Dubai is not a significant producer of oil or manufactured goods. Dubai is a logistics hub, an aviation hub, a financial hub. The financial and commercial infrastructure of Dubai exists because Dubai sits at the intersection of trade flows connecting South Asia, East Africa, the Gulf states, and the broader Middle East. Dubai made itself indispensable to those flows, and then sold financial and professional services to everyone who moved goods through it. The Kufr country's current security and political problems, which the Iran war has made dramatically worse, are creating what regional analysts are calling a flight of financial activity from the Gulf. Multinationals that had regional headquarters in Dubai or Riyadh are looking for alternatives. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is trying to capture some of this activity. Istanbul is also positioned as a potential beneficiary, with established financial infrastructure, a large domestic economy, membership in the G20, and geographic proximity to both European and Middle Eastern markets. Think about what this means for an ordinary Turkish family. Turkey has been struggling with inflation, currency depreciation, and high borrowing costs for years. The lira has lost enormous value against the dollar and euro. Foreign direct investment has been tepid. If Turkey successfully converts its geographic position into a logistics and finance hub, the economic consequences are transformative. Jobs in logistics, in financial services, in infrastructure construction and operation, tax revenues from transit trade, foreign direct investment attracted by the hub status, the kind of sustained economic development that Turkey has been trying and largely failing to achieve through manufacturing alone. Real Turkish families would feel this in employment, in currency stability, in the kinds of jobs that pay wages high enough to keep educated young people in the country, rather than emigrating to Germany or the Netherlands. The fourth structural force is the historical parallel, and it is one that every Turkish strategist knows, but that Western analysis consistently ignores. The Ottoman Empire was at its height a logistics empire more than a military empire. Its power rested not primarily on its armies, but on its control of the trade routes connecting Europe to Asia and Africa. The Silk Road passed through Ottoman territory. The spice route passed through Ottoman ports. The Hajj route passed through Ottoman lands. Istanbul was the intersection of trade flows from 3 continents. The empire's wealth came from its ability to tax and facilitate the movement of goods and people through this network. The empire declined not primarily because it was defeated militarily, though it was defeated militarily. It declined because the age of sail made ocean routes commercially viable for the first time, and suddenly the Silk Road through Ottoman territory was no longer the most efficient way to move goods between Asia and Europe. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 did more structural damage to the Ottoman Empire than any military campaign. It routed the trade around Turkey rather than through it. The Hejaz Railway project is, from a structural history perspective, an attempt to reverse that dynamic, to make Turkey's land position competitively attractive again against maritime routes that are now being disrupted by Hormuz blockades, Houthi attacks, and Suez Canal congestion. The same geopolitical disruptions that are damaging maritime trade are making land routes more attractive. And Turkey is the only country that can anchor a land route from Europe to the Gulf that does not pass through Iran or Russia. Structure, geography, history, 3 forces pointing in the same direction. Now let me tell you about the one thing that is standing in the way. Every analysis of Turkey's logistics hub potential reaches the same conclusion at the same point. The geography is right, the infrastructure projects are real, the political alignment is improving, and then the analysis stops at the same obstacle: legal certainty. Foreign investors and multinational corporations do not locate logistics operations, financial services, or regional headquarters in countries where the legal system is unpredictable, where contracts can be invalidated by political decisions, where the independence of the judiciary is compromised, where currency controls can be imposed without warning, where the regulatory environment changes faster than businesses can adapt. Turkey has a genuine problem on every one of these dimensions. The World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index consistently ranked Turkey below where its geographic and economic fundamentals would suggest it should be. Foreign direct investment into Turkey has been structurally weak relative to peers like Poland, the Czech Republic, or the UAE, countries with smaller geographic advantages but stronger legal environment. The currency crisis of 2018 and the inflation shock of 2022 to 2024 reflected in part a lack of investor confidence in the institutional framework that governs economic policy. The Hejaz Railway can be built, the transit corridor can be opened, the infrastructure investment can create a physical route, but logistics companies will not locate their regional hubs in Istanbul if they believe that a contract dispute will be resolved by a court that is politically influenced. Financial firms will not relocate from Dubai to Istanbul if they fear that capital controls could be imposed to manage a future currency crisis. The physical infrastructure is necessary but not sufficient. This is the one condition: legal certainty, institutional credibility, the kind of predictable, rules-based operating environment that allows businesses to make long-term investment decisions without pricing in the cost of arbitrary government intervention. Turkey has the geography. Turkey is building the infrastructure. Turkey has the political relationships, with Erdogan having navigated to a position where he is simultaneously talking to Moscow, Beijing, Washington, Riyadh, and Tehran. What Turkey has not yet delivered is the institutional environment that would allow foreign capital to arrive at scale and stay. Watch 4 things in the coming months and years. The first thing to watch is the Saudi feasibility study due by the end of 2026. This study will determine whether Riyadh formally commits to integrating its existing rail network, which already runs from Riyadh to the Gulf Coast, into the Hejaz Railway revival project. Saudi financial commitment would transform the project from a regional aspiration into a commercially viable corridor. Watch the financing structure that emerges from the study. If Saudi Arabia commits sovereign wealth fund investment to the project, it signals that Riyadh has made a strategic decision to develop the land route as its primary alternative to IMEC. The second thing to watch is the Gaziantep to Aleppo rail link. This is the critical bottleneck in the Turkish section of the corridor. The line exists but requires significant upgrading to handle modern freight volumes. Turkish Transport Ministry has identified this as a priority investment. Watch for contract awards and construction timelines. If work begins in the second half of 2026, the corridor could be partially operational by 2028 to 2030. If it stalls, the entire project timeline shifts. The third thing to watch is foreign direct investment into Turkish logistics infrastructure. The physical infrastructure is being built with government and regional sovereign funding. But the services layer, the freight forwarding companies, the warehousing operators, the financial services firms that turn physical infrastructure into a commercial hub, requires private capital. Watch whether European and Asian companies begin establishing logistics operations in Turkey at scale. That flow of private capital is the leading indicator that the legal certainty problem is being addressed, or at least that investors are deciding the risk is acceptable. The fourth thing to watch is IMEC's status in relation to any Israeli-Saudi normalization progress. If normalization advances and IMEC is revived as a serious project with Saudi backing, it competes directly with the Hejaz Railway corridor for the same trade flows. The two projects are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are competing for the same role as the primary land and sea bridge between Asia and Europe. Watch whether Saudi Arabia chooses to back one, both, or neither. Riyadh's choice will be the decisive signal about which corridor becomes dominant. The structural conclusion is this: Turkey has a once-in-a-generation opportunity to convert its geographic position into permanent structural power in the global economy. The disruption of maritime trade routes by the Iran war, the Houthi attacks, and Suez Canal congestion has made land routes more competitive than at any point in modern economic history. The collapse of Syria's isolation has opened the land corridor that makes the Hejaz Railway physically possible. The Saudi feasibility study signals that the region's most powerful economy is taking the corridor seriously. And the IMEC project's political difficulties have created a window that the Turkish route can fill. The opportunity is real. The obstacle is also real. Turkey cannot become the Venice or the Singapore of the 21st century without the institutional framework that made Venice and Singapore safe places to do business. Legal certainty is not a technicality. It is the foundation on which every other element of the logistics hub strategy depends. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. I might be wrong about whether the Saudi feasibility study produces a commitment or a delay. I might be wrong about whether Turkey addresses the legal certainty problem at the speed the opportunity requires. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. Save this analysis, come back at the end of 2026. Check whether the Saudi study has produced a financing commitment. Check whether foreign direct investment into Turkish logistics is accelerating. Check whether the Gaziantep to Aleppo link has broken ground. The answers will tell you whether Turkey is on course to become the logistics bridge of the 21st century, or whether this generation's opportunity is passing to someone else. Subscribe if you want to follow this as it develops. Because the story of who controls the trade routes between Europe and Asia is the story of who shapes the global economy for the next 100 years. And Turkey is closer to that position right now than at any point since the fall of the Ottoman Empire.